All right, ladies, here we go. Unit 10, personality. Woo! So this slide gives you an overview of what we're studying with our personality unit. There are four major perspectives on personality. The first being psychoanalytic, and this is one of the oldest. Sigmund Freud is huge in the psychoanalytic perspective, and we talked a little bit about that before with psychodynamic perspective at the beginning of the year. Looking at the past, looking at childhood, and we'll get into that in some future slides. And then we have Alfred Adler, Karen Horney, and Carl Jung. Our next perspective is humanistic, and this looks at the present day and the future, what we aspire to be as human beings. And then we have a different way of looking at personality, which would be the trait perspective. So you've got Gordon Allport, Raymond B. Cattell, Isabel Briggs Myers, and McCrae and Costa. And then the final one is looking at how our environment plays a role, and so we look at the social cognitive perspective with Albert Bandura. Your book shows you the biopsychosocial model to personality at the very end, where it wraps up three different views of looking at personality, and we know that we have to look at all three views and how our personality is created. We can't have one without the other. Our personality is an absolute mixture of these three: biological influences, psychological influences, and social cultural influences. Looking at the biological influences, we know that our personality is determined genetically, and we can study the temperament of babies. We find that babies who are reactive, they tend to be type A personalities, and babies that are non-reactive tend to be type B personalities. Those non-reactive babies are ones that you can pass around, and they're just kind of chilled out, relaxed. Reactive babies are a little more anxious. They might be more likely to cry if a stranger holds them. And then we also know that our autonomic nervous system tends to be very reactive if we're introverts. And if you think about that, our autonomic nervous system, part of that is your sympathetic nervous system, where your adrenaline rushes and your heart starts beating really quickly. And so someone who is an introvert, if they are in a social gathering, they might have a sympathetic nervous system that kicks into high gear. It might be very reactive, and it makes them feel a little uncomfortable in those situations where there are a lot of people. We also know that people who are extroverts have lower arousal in their frontal lobe. So if they normally have lower arousal in that frontal lobe area, they might do things that are a little more adventurous just to get that arousal going. And then we look at psychological influences, and so we've got learned responses. We look at learned helplessness. We look at the internal versus the external locus of control. And again, those are going to be on some future slides. And then we also have to take into account our environment. What is our childhood like? What kind of situation are we in? How is that changing our personality? Because, in different situations, you're going to act a little bit differently. You might act like an introvert at school. You're quiet, you listen to the teacher talk, and you might think of all of your teachers as extroverts because they stand up in front of the class and they talk to you and they become the center of attention. But a lot of the teachers that you have are not extroverts. It's just the situation that they are in. So let's jump right into the psychoanalytic perspective. And here you see Sigmund Freud, and his big thing is the unconscious mind. So in a future slide, we'll talk about conscious versus unconscious and preconscious, but when you think psychoanalytic perspective and when you think about Sigmund Freud, automatically think of the unconscious mind. With Freud, he thinks that who you are is a direct result of who you were as a child, and maybe some sexual repression that you had, or maybe you were sexually abused as a child, but something happened and that has been stored in your unconscious mind. So Freud, he looks at psychoanalysis, and when he was younger, he didn't aspire to be a psychiatrist. It just kind of fell into play. People who were mentally ill, they were institutionalized. No one knew how to treat those who were mentally ill, and a lot of what they did was incredibly inhumane. Like, they would spray someone with a fire hose, or they would put them in a chair and they would spin them around, or they would put them in isolation. And Freud knew that this was not good, and no good results were coming from this. So he came up with talk therapy. So if you ever see a Freudian couch in his office, he had a couch. And so when you think of a psychiatrist and you go to a counseling session, a lot of times we think, well, I'm laying on this couch and I'm just talking to my therapist. And that kind of stems from Freud, because he would say, come on in, have a seat, relax, and just tell me what's on your mind. So in this, he's performing psychoanalysis. He's trying to analyze the psyche. And when he says just talk about whatever it is that pops in your head, he's looking at free association. So with free association, anything that pops in your head, no matter how bizarre it is, he says, talk about it, and he thinks that will all link and we can find something deeper in the mind. He's known as the archaeologist of the mind because he wanted to know why your mind was thinking that way and how do we dig deep into your mind. He also used hypnosis on his patients. He thought that was a way to alter your states of consciousness and maybe pull some of that unconscious information to your conscious awareness. And remember we talked about Freud with dream analysis? So we talked about the manifest and the latent content of dreams. The manifest content of dream is what the dream is actually of, and then the latent content is the hidden aspect of the dream. And it's Freud, and a lot of what Freud talks about is sex. So the latent content of the dream was usually something that was sexual. Freudian slips of the tongue. So with Freudian slips, he says that, if I were counting and I said 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, sex, that would be a Freudian slip. And so when I said the word sex and I meant to say 6, I was actually thinking about sex. This is what Freud says. Because again, everything is sexual. But when we, in general, talk about slips of the tongue, it doesn't always have to be sexual. It's just random things that Freud would say we're thinking about unconsciously, and we just say it consciously. But he gets a lot of criticism for this because people say it's, a memory issue. Maybe they're trying to say one word, but another word came out, but it didn't necessarily mean anything with their unconscious. So Freud gets the bad rap for being a pervert, but to defend him somewhat, he's not really a pervert. A lot of his theories just kind of stem from sex. And one piece of evidence I can say is a patient that he had. He said that she came onto him in one of their therapy sessions, that this woman jumped off the couch and tried to kiss him. And he was like, oh, no. And he said, you're not actually thinking of me. You've got this sexual repression for someone else. And because I'm your therapist and you're talking to me about it, you're transferring all of that love and desire you have for this other person on me. And that's where he comes up with transference. So here we have the structure of personality, or Freud's idea of the mind's structure. And it looks like an iceberg because an iceberg, when you look at it, you only see the tip of the iceberg. You only see a small portion of the iceberg. But most of it is going to be underwater. And so Freud says that's kind of how your personality is. You only see the tip of your personality, but most of your personality is totally unconscious. So here's where we're going to look at conscious, unconscious, and then this preconscious, which is kind of your transition state. So your unconscious is things that you're not aware of. It's below your awareness level, and it could be these wishes or feelings or memories or thoughts that you have, but you don't even know that you're having them. And then your conscious is what you are aware of, the thoughts that you are aware that you're having. And then in your preconscious, it's kind of this just transition. So if something was in your unconscious, it might come to that preconscious transition state, and then it would move into your conscious. Non-conscious is something that we've seen before, and I think we looked at it in one of the study guides, and it popped up in a question previously, but your non-conscious is not really what Freud is exploring. Your non-conscious is things that are happening automatically, like we're breathing. Yeah, if we're paying attention to it, we know that we're breathing, but most of the time we go through the day and we're not conscious about our breathing. And be careful not to talk about conscious and conscience. They are very different. Conscious is your awareness. Conscience is your ability to make the distinction between right or wrong. So we need to dig in a little deeper to the structure of personality that Freud discusses. And I pulled in this our previous slide with the id, the ego, and the superego because we didn't really talk about it too much before. We just talked about the levels of consciousness. Freud says that everyone is born with an id. It's not an ID, it's an id. And so he says that this is our pleasure principle. And this is where sex and aggression, it's where those drives stem from. And we need immediate gratification from the id. When you think of babies, babies are governed by their id. They're governed by that pleasure principle. When they're hungry, it can be 2 a.m., 4 a.m., whatever time of the night it is. If they're hungry, they want those needs met, and they want it met now. So they're going to scream and cry until you go pick them up. They don't care that you need to sleep, that you've got to teach school the next day. They don't care. They just want to eat, and they want to eat now. Freud says that they're governed by their id. Everyone is born with it. Everyone has those needs and desires, and they want to be met. So if you look at the iceberg here, the iceberg shows that your id is mostly unconscious. You have these drives, but you're not even aware of what those drives are or when you're having those needs. He says that later your ego develops, and your ego is your reality principle. It's your reality check. It's looking at what can I actually do, what can't I do. And your ego and your superego, they tend to develop around like 4 or 5 years old. And so Freud says that by the age of 5, your personality is fully developed, which he also gets a lot of criticism about that too. But the ego is just trying to balance the needs of the id. But it also has to balance the needs of the superego. And your superego is your conscience. So remember I talked about conscious versus conscience. Let's look at the iceberg again. So we've got our superego, and we have all the stuff up here is in your conscious, and all the stuff down here is in your unconscious. Your superego actually has both conscious and unconscious, and this is where your conscience is stored. This is where right or wrong is actually coming from. And if you notice, most of it is actually unconscious. Your conscience, most of it is unconscious. So that's why we have to be very careful with the distinction of those two words. Okay, so I went to psychology training, and the person instructing it really liked The Simpsons. So the id, if you're familiar with The Simpsons, the id is Homer. Homer wants to drink, he wants to eat donuts, and he wants to do it now. He's pretty selfish, but that's just kind of how he is. So he's run by the id. Marge is the Homer's wife. She's the mom, and she's kind of the reality principal. She's the reality check. And then Lisa's the daughter, and she is very right, wrong. She always wants to do the right thing. She's pretty virtuous. She would have petitions signed for doing the right thing, and but that's kind of the superego. And then when most people think of Freud, this is really what they're thinking of. He has developed these psychosexual stages, and Myers used to put this in with our developmental unit, and you even saw it in the little copy of the developmental unit that I passed out to you, but we're really focusing on it in this unit. So Freud says that when you're born until you're about 18 months, so at a year and a half, you're in this oral stage. And so every stage that you have, there's an erogenous zone. So if you're a baby, your erogenous zone is your mouth. You suck, you bite, you chew, everything you pick up goes right in your mouth. And he says that babies seek pleasure from things in their mouth. So he says that they're in this oral stage. Well, what's interesting is he also talks about fixation. So with fixation, we're looking at if something happened to you while you're in this stage, maybe abuse, maybe you weren't in the stage long enough, maybe you were in the stage too long, but regardless, something happened in the stage. You might develop an oral fixation. So later in life, you might bite your nails, or you might smoke cigarettes, or you might chew gum all the time. But he says that we have this fixation where we need to have that pleasure in our mouth. So from the oral stage, you move into the anal stage. And this is the time where babies are being potty trained. The 2, 3 years old, that's all in the anal stage. And so our erogenous zone would be our anus. But basically, we are controlling our urine, we are controlling our fecal matter. And so he says that if something were to happen in this stage and you experience fixation, you could be anal expulsive, or you could become an anal retentive adult. And when we usually say someone's being anal, we're talking about the anal retentive kind. And so we would say that they're, very particular, they like things a certain way, and we would say they're anal retentive. So Freud would say something happened to them, in this stage of the anal of his psychosexual stages of development, and maybe they, didn't like a poopy diaper, so they held it all in, because they didn't like things to be messy. But on the other hand of that, there's anal expulsive, and that would be, maybe they didn't care if they walked around with a poopy diaper for hours. They didn't care if they pooped in their underwear instead of a diaper. It didn't matter. And so those people tend to be very messy adults. They're unorganized, they're kind of scattered, they're all over the place. But Freud would say it was because of this anal stage of development. Then the most interesting stage is this phallic stage. And that's going to be 3 to 6 years old. And so your erogenous zone, here's your genitals. And here's where we also call this the Oedipal stage. So in this phallic stage, we have identification, the Oedipus complex, and the Electra complex going on here. So you all have read about Oedipus Rex, where the boy married his mom and he annoyingly killed his father. Well, Freud says that little boys have these feelings. Mama's boys. They want to be with their mom. They don't want to have any attention with their dads. They, are pushing their dads away because they want to stay with their moms. And he talks about incestuous sexual feelings, which is another reason he gets a bad rap, because who talks about a 3 to 6 year old truly wanting and desiring sex with their mother? So this is this is a theory, and we can't. It's actually a good theory because we can't test it. We can't deny it. We have no way of knowing if 3 to 6 year olds actually have sexual feelings for the parents. We cannot test it. So these little boys who have desires for the moms, Freud calls this the Oedipus complex. And the Electra complex is little girls who are in love with their dads and want to get rid of their moms. He says that in the stage, kids often see their parents naked, or they see another kid naked, and so this is where they're kind of identifying with who they are. So if it's a little boy and a little boy sees a little girl naked for the first time, and whoa, what happened to her penis? Where did it go? Right? That's weird. Never seen anything like that. They thought that all people had penises. So they might think, well, who could have possibly done that to her? Who could have cut off her penis? The only person strong enough to do that is her dad. So this is kind of a keep your friends close, keep your enemies closer. And at this time, little boys are identifying with their fathers because they both have penises, and maybe their moms don't have a penis. And so this is where gender roles are really going to take effect. Then you move into this latency stage, and latency, I call it the cootie stage. This is where little boys and little girls really don't want to play with each other, don't want to be around each other, they just want no part of each other. And then you hit the genital stage, and that's when puberty sets in, so your sexual interests are there. Freud says that your ego has to balance the superego and the id, and sometimes it can't. Like the id's desires are so strong, or the superego is just very rigid and moralistic and doesn't give you any leeway. And so the ego is like, it's stressed and it can't do what it needs to do. And so he says when that happens, these defense mechanisms will kick in. And just to go through some examples of each, and then you all are going to do a worksheet on this. But repression we've talked about, and that's where you're blocking memories. It's not that the memories have disappeared. They're still in your brain. They're just kind of locked in there. You've blocked them out. You can't access them. But they're there. Regression is where you're kind of reverting back to your childhood. So maybe you get sick and all you want is your mom. You just want your mom to cuddle with you, lay in bed with you, or you have a little blankie and you just kind of regress. You're reverting back. Reaction formation is where you take a feeling and you flip it to the opposite feeling. So maybe you actually hate your dad, like you just hate him, but you flip that and you feel love for your dad, and you talk about how much you love him all the time, but in reality you don't like him. I hope that's not true. But that's a reaction formation where you're taking a feeling and you're just totally flipping it. Projection is one that's often confused, and so with projection, you are projecting your feelings onto someone else. So basically, you're accusing someone else of having the feelings that you do. So maybe you think that someone is homosexual, but you don't talk about you feeling that someone is homosexual. You then blame someone else or accuse someone else of having those feelings, even though you don't even know if they do or don't. You're projecting your feelings onto them. So if you see blaming or accusing or something like that, that is usually from projection. Rationalization, you're just finding excuses to explain something. If it's displacement, so like if you got a bad grade on a psych test, you could displace those feelings. You could throw your desk down. You could slam the door on your way out, but you're displacing those feelings onto something else. The desk didn't do anything to you. The door didn't do anything to you. Or maybe you go home and you're really mean to your little sister. That's displacement, because those people or things had nothing to do with the event, but you're taking that feeling or aggression out on them. Sublimation is a form of displacement, but it's actually in a good way. So if you're getting divorced and you write a song about it, or write a book about it, or paint a painting, or have a great piece of artwork, you're displacing those negative feelings, but you're doing so in a good way, and that's when it's sublimation. And then the last defense mechanism is going to be denial, where you just refuse to believe that something is true. Neo-Freudians. So Neo-Freudians were really... Neo, I don't want to throw you off. Neo is just saying they're the new Freuds. They're taking Freud's ideas and they're changing them to fit their own needs. Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud used to be really good pals. Got a little weird because Freud got intimidated by Carl Jung and would pass out whenever they were together. So they kind of parted ways. But they both believed in the unconscious. When we look at Neo-Freudians, we're looking at this psychoanalytic perspective. So we're looking at something that happened in childhood, something that happened in the past, and it's created the way that you are today. So Carl Jung says, Freud, you're right, we have an unconscious, but Jung differs because he says that all human beings have the exact same unconscious, and he calls it a collective unconscious. So things that are dark, we're automatically afraid of, and he says that that's because of our collective unconscious. Archetypes would be those dark things, right? Like if something is dark and lurking behind you, you automatically feel fear. Nothing had to happen to you in the past for you to feel fear, but in your unconscious, that has been passed down from generation to generation. Alfred Adler. So this poor guy was sick as a kid, and so he was picked on a lot, and he comes up with this inferiority complex. So he says, Freud, you're right, a lot of who you are is because of your childhood, but he says it's not really sexual abuse. It's because of your social skills. How were you with friends? How were you with peers? And that has created who you are as a person. So he says that we often feel inferior, and when we do, we tend to overcompensate for that inferiority. And then you have Karen Horney, and it's Horney, it's not horny, but Karen Horney, she talks about womb envy. What I didn't tell you before, in that phallic stage that Freud talks about, he says that women have penis envy because they don't have a penis and they want one, and that penises are power. And Karen Horney says, whoa, Freud, nope, guys have womb envy because you can't have kids and we can. We don't have penis envy. But her big thing is also childhood, and she says that we need love and we need security, and if we don't have that as a kid, that's going to affect us for the rest of our life.